Hi, everybody, mostly Beach Boys fans. I decided I am going to do a literary video, as it were, and I'm going to show my Beach Boys book collection, of which is not nearly as extensive as my Beatles book collection. And I know these videos don't get a whole lot of views, but I don't know, what the hell. I figure there might be some people that are interested in, my library of Beatles stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. I don't care. So the first book that I have is Brian Wilson's Wouldn't It Be Nice? This is the very first Beach Boys book that I ever bought. And it's a fascinating autobiography from Brian Wilson, if you believe, in fact, that Brian Wilson actually wrote it. I know there's been some criticism of this book that it was actually ghostwritten by Dr. Landy, and it's got a lot of his influence, a lot of his views. At the end, Dr. Landy is painted in a very sympathetic light, which, of course, if you know the Brian Wilson story, that's very much the farthest thing from the truth. Dr. Landy may have saved Brian Wilson's life, but he certainly hasn't done him any favors since he got his weight down and got him off of the addictive substances that he was partaking in. But it's still very much an accurate depiction, I believe, for the most part, having read it many times, of the Beach Boys story, and pretty close to, I believe, what happened and probably how Brian felt about a lot of his time with the Beach Boys and a lot of the ups and the downs. It does talk about his break with Dr. Landy. However, a lot of the blame in this book rests on Carl Wilson and the other Beach Boys. There's really no ownership for Dr. Landy for why that relationship was severed. But nonetheless, it's still a fascinating look at the Beach Boys. There's some good photographs in here that cover the early Beach Boys period. Some early photographs, as well as some later. And a lot of, this book does spend a lot of time on Brian Wilson's recovery and him losing a lot of weight. In the late 70s and early 80s, Brian Wilson's weight started to balloon and balloon and balloon. He was just not taking care of himself. He was not performing up to, and I hate to even say up to his capacity. He was pretty much shoved out on the road with the Beach Boys. Did not want to be there. So he kind of zoned out and would do things almost to sabotage some of the Beach Boys performances. But a lot of the book is spent on his recovery, him kind of getting back in the 80s into more of a productive role, not only with the Beach Boys, but also with some of the solo material that he would end up composing. So anyway, this book, there's been another Brian Wilson book that followed this one that is probably more, actually Brian Wilson's thoughts and how he feels about things. But still, it's an interesting read. I have to say, there's just so many fascinating things that happened during not only Brian Wilson's career, but the Beach Boys' career. So definitely a worthwhile read. Second book I have, and this deals exclusively with Brian Wilson's lost masterpiece, as this book refers to it, the Smile album. Talks a little bit about the transition from the glory of Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations, and delves pretty deep into the story of Smile, what happened, how it all fell apart, kind of the aftermath of the Smile, but definitely the most detailed exploration into, exactly what was Smile all about, Brian's mental state, why were the tracks shelved, and this was, I believe, written closely right around the time when Brian actually released it or started touring the Smile album. This is before they did the Beach Boys version of the Smile album a little later in the 2000s. But it's really a fascinating read if you enjoy Smile as much as I do, at least. Next book I have is called The Nearest Far Away Place, and this is written by Timothy White. It's a nice overview of the Beach Boys. And I found with a lot of the Beach Boys books that I have, the person who wrote the book can't help editorializing not only the Beach Boys music, but sort of judging decisions that were made, and in particular, Mike Love, and just in general, the trajectory of their career. This book is probably the most objective out of all the Beach Boys books that I have. Pretty lengthy one, but it's an enjoyable read, covers their entire career. I don't know that this would necessarily be the book to get, but it's pretty well balances all of the Beach Boys instead of focusing exclusively on Brian Wilson, as most Beach Boys books tend to do. And I'm not necessarily saying that's unjustified that they would focus on Brian Wilson, but nonetheless, it's a pretty objective, for the most part, view of the Beach Boys and their career. Next book I have is by Stephen Gaines, and this is called Heroes and Villains, The True Story of the Beach Boys. This book pulls no punches, all the warts of the Beach Boys here. We're talking about the whole, Brian Wilson's, deteriorating mental condition, Dennis Wilson and all of his addictions, the train wreck that was his life, unfortunately. What an asshole Mike Love is. This book is especially brutal on Mike Love. If you're not a Mike Love fan, this is the book for you, because it's really, and I don't want to call myself a Mike Love sympathizer, but the way he's treated and characterized in this book is really almost painful to read. You can tell that Stephen Gaines definitely is not in any way a Mike Love fan. Almost makes fun of Mike Love in this book. But again, also, the story is very much Brian Wilson centered, very sympathetic to Brian Wilson. And there's just so much dysfunction that went on with the Beach Boys, from the fact that Dennis Wilson married Mike Love's illegitimate daughter, which is kind of like sensitive, but also kind of funny. It was almost like the ultimate fuck you to Mike Love by Dennis Wilson, because the two of them, there was no love lost there, and they did not get along at all. But this is a very entertaining read, and one that I would definitely recommend. But it definitely is, a harsh look at the Beach Boys. They were not perfect. They were not angelic. They may have been called America's band, but they certainly were not goody two-shoes. And it's just really a very entertaining read. The next book, and this is very much Brian Wilson centered, is called Catch a Wave, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson. This also, in many cases, it's a very informative read, but the author, who in this case is Peter Ames Carlin, he has such a sense of humor, and the way he tells certain stories is just really hilarious. But, and I don't know if it's a proper way to say it, or if I'm, selling the book short, but I mean, he treats the subject matter seriously, but he approaches it in such a way that, you can't help laughing and smiling, especially when he talks about Mike Love and his objections to Pet Sounds, the way he hated Van Dyke Parks and couldn't understand his lyrics for the Smile album. But he does it in such a way that's just so funny. And the stories that he tells in here that really are hilarious. There's the good and the bad, and I think he balances that pretty well. And it's very much skewed. Brian Wilson's story is told in some cases at the expense of the other Beach Boys, but for most Beach Boys fan, they're mostly interested in Brian Wilson anyway. So, but it's just a great read. Again, his style of writing is very entertaining, very funny at times. Spends a lot of time on Pet Sounds and the Smile album, but also sort of the decline, the rise, and then the decline again of the Beach Boys. So it covers their entire career, as well as Brian's career and sort of his rise again to become a great singer and songwriter and performer. And then probably the most polarizing book of all the Beach Boys books that I have is Mike Love's Autobiography, Good Vibrations, My Life as a Beach Boy. So again, as you would expect, you know, you're going to read a lot of Mike Love talking about, oh, I never had a problem with Pet Sounds. I loved Smile. Yeah, I didn't understand some of Van Dyke Park's lyrics, but Brian Wilson is brilliant, and I was never, you know, he sort of definitely tries to, you know, airbrush and resurrect his image, because he's certainly the villain of the Beach Boys story for most people. But it's still, you know, seeing things from Mike's perspective, even if you're not a Mike Love fan, seeing things from Mike Love's perspective, I think is worthwhile. And, you know, you do walk away from it feeling like, well, maybe he's not such an asshole. Maybe he's not such a dick like all the other books have portrayed him. But still, I mean, you got to give Mike Love some credit. He was an integral part of the Beach Boys songwriting for, you know, the 60s and some of the 70s. He wrote the lyrics for Good Vibrations, California Girls. So very much an important part of the Beach Boys. And to hear his side of the story, just to read it, I think is still, you know, very worthwhile. There's a lot of pictures in here, but I'm glad I have this as a part of my collection. I'm not a huge Mike Love fan, but I did like this book, and I'm glad I have it. And then kind of the yin to the yang, this is the second, but truly authorized, I guess, if there is such a word, for an autobiography. I Am Brian Wilson. One thing about this book, it's not in chronological order. He jumps around a lot. He doesn't tell the story from beginning to the present day. Kind of jumps around, tells a lot of stories. Some of the anecdotes in terms of him listening to Beatle albums, what he thinks about Beatles songs. He was a huge fan of the Beatles song, Won't You See Me? And he talks about Rubber Soul, what he really admired about that album. Talks certainly about all the things you would want to hear about, Pet Sounds, Smile, and, you know, his own recovery and all of that. But it's just not in chronological order. It seems a little bit scattered at times, but I still find it a very good read, a very enjoyable read. If you want the story told by Brian Wilson in chronological order, maybe you want to research the first album, but this is still an enjoyable read for sure. And then the last Beach Boys book that I have, and this is almost a coffee table book. It's the Beach Boys in Concert, and it chronicles the Beach Boys' career as a live band. I mean, it covers pretty much early 1962 all the way through the present day. It's got dates, it's got locations, it's got set lists, everything that you would want. It's got a lot of very cool pictures also along with this. A lot of live photographs, and there are quotes from people. You know, press clippings and whatnot. So a really extensive chronicle of the Beach Boys as a touring band, and from their earliest days, again, all the way up through the present. So just a really great read if you're interested in kind of seeing how the Beach Boys evolved as a touring band. So anyway, that is my Beach Boys book collection. And I'm curious if you have any books that I don't have, or, you know, what your own take on the Beach Boys story is. Thank you for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for liking, and take care.